This happened a few years ago, in the autumn, on a night that I would personally call pretty typical. It was pretty deep autumn. All the trees had shifted to their pretty colors, and it was starting to get cold. We hadn't gotten snow yet, but we'd gone through a few bouts of pretty heavy rain here and there over the previous month. I was a senior in high school at the time, 17 for a few more months. I lived with my mom in my childhood home still, and it was just the two of us, as my dad was KIA overseas when I was a little girl. I remember that night was a pretty creepy and dark one, and we were getting hit with those storms that I previously mentioned. It was raining like crazy. I had decided to go ahead and stay home instead of going out with my boyfriend because of how bad it was out. Plus, I was exhausted after all my schoolwork, volleyball practice, and then having to study for midterms. By the time I got home, I was looking forward to a quiet evening just doing whatever I wanted at home. My mom was a nurse at a local hospital, and she had to work the night shift, so I had the whole house to myself. I made myself something to eat and watched a couple episodes of something on Netflix before I decided that I would just go to bed early. By early in this situation, I mean around 8. It was still downpouring when I went up to brush my teeth. By the time I crawled into bed, it had turned from just rain to some pretty heavy winds and a lot of lightning. I remember thinking that I was going to wake up to the tornado sirens. That's how bad the storm was getting. I plugged my phone in to make sure that I had a charge in case the power went out, and I laid there with the TV on the news, but down low enough that I could barely hear it. I put my head down on my pillow and stared at the ceiling. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remembered was being jolted awake by what sounded like a loud bang. Disoriented, I looked at my clock and it was a bit past 10 p.m. The storm was still going, though it had definitely slowed some. I paused for a second thinking that the bang was probably just thunder from a close-by lightning strike, but then I heard it again. A distinct, sharp bang coming from downstairs. My heart started racing. I wasn't sure if this was someone banging on the door to get my attention, or if it was someone hitting the door to break it down. I wasn't fully awake nor 100% sure what to do, so I exited my room and walked out into the hallway to see if I could figure out which it was. As soon as I opened my door and stepped out, I heard one more loud bang and the sound of wood splintering. It was pretty obvious at this point which one it was. Unfortunately, I was upstairs, and there were no exits up there. If I went downstairs, I would pass by the front door no matter which direction I tried to go, meaning that I would pass by whoever it was that had just kicked the door in. I ultimately decided to run back into my bedroom, lock the door, and call 911 with my cell phone, which thankfully I had on my end table. I ran back down the hallway into my room, locked it up, and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 as I crawled under my bed, just trying to hide in any way that I could. The silence of the room as I laid there breathing heavily and waiting for the call to connect was insufferable. I didn't know if the person that had kicked the door in was now in the house, or where in the house they were. The 911 operator finally answered, and I explained what had happened in a hushed but terrified tone. I told her my address and said that I was upstairs and that someone had kicked in the front door. She told me that the police were on the way, and asked me for a bit more information. Specifically, if I had seen the person at all, or if I knew they were in the house. I told her that I didn't know, and that I had not seen him, because I had just heard the sound of the door being kicked in and then hid. She told me to stay where I was, and to stay as quiet as I could, and did everything to keep me calm and keep me informed on how close the police were. I just stayed right where I was, trying to keep my breathing stable, but struggling to really pull in any air. It was dark, quiet, and the only sound that I could hear outside of my phone was the rain as it smacked my window. After about 5 minutes, the dispatcher told me that the officers were in the driveway, but to stay where I was until they called out to me to come out. I told her that I would, and she waited on the line with me until that happened. When the officers called out, I told her that they were there and thanked her before disconnecting. I walked out of my room and went down the stairs to meet the officers. As they stood in the doorway and were looking around at the damage to the door, the deadbolt was completely splintered and destroyed. There was wood on the floor, and I could see muddy shoe prints on the front of the door as it sort of just swung there, seeming to be barely attached. The officer took some information from me and said that they had looked around the yard already but didn't see anybody. They then came in to clear the other rooms and make sure that this guy wasn't hiding somewhere, but there was nobody else there. Based on the amount of mud on the front door, I think we would have been able to figure out if he'd walked in. So, based on that, it looked like they had just kicked in the door and walked away. I honestly have no idea why someone would do that. Why someone would kick in the door to a house and then not enter said house. Was this just to scare anyone that was there, or was it some kind of messed up prank? I'm honestly asking, as I have no idea. I had to call my mom and tell her about what happened, and the officer stayed for the extra 20 or so minutes while my mom got home. I explained the whole thing to her, and the officer gave her information for a case number, but basically said that there was not a high chance of us finding who did this, because it kind of looked like a random act of vandalism at this point. My mom had to get into contact with someone to come out the next day to repair the door, which was an expensive hassle, but thankfully it was able to get done quickly. One more thing to note about the situation. The next day, the neighbor on the side of the street actually came over and mentioned that his Ring camera had picked up what happened, and he didn't notice it until that afternoon. He showed us the video, and you could see this man in a black hoodie and black pants walk down the street until he got in front of our house. He just stopped there in front of it, seemed to stand there for a couple of moments before walking through our yard, stepping up on the porch, and literally giving the door 3 solid kicks until it gave way. He leaned into the house, like just his head, and seemed to glance around for half a second, before turning around and walking back down the sidewalk, and continuing down the street like nothing had happened. We couldn't see his face because of how dark it was, but we had video of what had happened, and obviously gave it to the police for all the good that it would do. It was just crazy to watch this play out. It was so random. It was as if this guy just was looking for a random door to kick. Like he didn't want to break in, he just wanted to let some frustration out. And I guess our door looked perfect for it. That night gave me some anxiety, and I didn't really like being home alone anymore, thinking it could happen again or that he would come back. My mom actually had a security camera installed on our front porch as well. I think that she was as freaked out as I was. It never did happen again, and it's been about 3 or 4 years since this took place, so I guess it was just a one-off random act of destruction. One that terrified me and left me thinking that something terrible was going to happen. As a child, the holidays were always filled with family, love, and fun. We all gathered at my Aunt Lisa and Uncle Scott's house, and some of us were there early the day of Thanksgiving, and the last ones to leave. We had some folks that would trickle in here and there just to stop by for a bit before they had to go to another family member's home. We typically showed up around noon, as my mom would make a few side dishes at home, and then I would be tasked with making sure the box of containers didn't spill in the back seat. I loved going over there because she was my favorite aunt. My Aunt Lisa was my dad's sister, and she was very eccentric, is the best way to put it. As more families showed up, I was excited when I saw my Uncle Todd arrive. He was my dad's youngest brother, and while I loved all of my other family members, he was a top-tier uncle. He was always known for his playful antics, cheesy jokes, and the way that he could effortlessly become the life of the party. But the Thanksgiving of 2001 would, unfortunately, change how I felt about Uncle Todd. Everyone started showing up and testing out the side dishes while my grandma and Aunt Lisa would shoo everyone away. There were a few of us kids playing in the yard, keeping ourselves entertained. Even when it came time for dinner, it went as well as any other family dinner. Later that night, those of us who were still there were relaxing and trying not to pass out from food comas. A lot of my cousins had already left, but one of my older cousins was in their room. She was Aunt Lisa and Uncle Scott's daughter. A few of my younger cousins were either playing together or were asleep on the couch. So I'd been sitting on the floor watching TV. While I was sitting there, my Uncle Todd came into the room and asked me what I was watching. I excitedly told him about the show, and, as kids often do, I had to explain the whole plot of the story and the characters. I watched him as I talked and could see his demeanor was different than what I was used to. He seemed somber, and his smile kind of felt forced. I asked him if he was okay, not knowing what else to do, and he smiled at me and said, "Yeah, of course, buddy. Hey, why don't you come with me? We need to run to the store real quick. Your mom asked me to pick up something." Again, I loved my Uncle Todd, and I thought going for a quick ride with him would be fun. I still had my shoes on, but it had been cold outside, so I walked towards the corridor to get my jacket, but my uncle stopped me, saying that I wasn't going to need it. He assured me that I could stay in the car in the heat when he got out. I thought that made sense, so when he motioned to go out the back door, located in the living room that I was in, I happily skipped out the door with him. The car ride started off normal enough. Uncle Todd asked me about school and my friends as we drove through the neighborhood. But as we turned onto the ramp to the highway, his tone and question trailed off, and I became curious as to where we were going. We didn't live far from my aunt and uncle's place, so I knew of at least one store that was close enough that we didn't need to take the highway. It was silent for probably a few seconds, but it became pretty awkward. I kept looking over at him and noticed how hard he was gripping the steering wheel while staring straight ahead. Then, without warning, Uncle Todd let out a wail and started to cry, causing me to jump. "You're lucky, you know," he said between his sobs. "You've got so much time ahead of you. So much time to decide what to do with your life. So much time to fix all your mistakes." His words confused me, especially as they were met with tears. I could feel the car was speeding up, going down the nearly empty highway, and I started to become terrified as well. As I felt the car shake from the speed, my uncle talked about missed opportunities, all of his unfulfilled dreams, and feeling trapped in a life that he never wanted. I could feel this huge sense of sadness looming over my uncle, and while I was now in tears from being terrified, I also found myself crying with him. And suddenly, Uncle Todd began yelling. I could just keep going, you know. I could drive off an embankment, no one could stop me. No one would have to feel sorry for me, and you would never have to experience this crushing reality of this hell that we call life. I didn't understand any of this, and I was terrified. Uncle Todd was always so full of life and happiness. I only ever saw people show him love, including myself. Why did he seem so sad now? Why was he saying all of these things? I was young enough to not understand what was happening, but old enough to know that if something didn't change, we could both die. I choked back tears and finally found my voice enough to say, I love you, Uncle Todd, no matter what. He kept looking over at me, taking these deep breaths, and after a heavy sigh, I felt the speed of the car start to decrease. He continued to sob, but it slowed down little by little, along with the car. He got off the highway and took the back roads in silence. He sniffled a few times, but that was all the sound that was being made inside the car. As we pulled back into the house, he looked at me, patted me on the shoulder, and said that he was sorry. He motioned for me to go ahead and get out, and I slowly hopped out, waiting for him to follow. But he stayed sitting in the driver's seat with the car off. Shortly after I got out, the scene became pretty chaotic. My mom came running outside. Her face was red and streaked with tears. She instantly grabbed me in a hug, telling me that I was okay, that I was safe. Everyone else was now outside, and several of my family members were shouting at Uncle Todd angrily. I was scared and relieved to be home, but all I could think about was my uncle. I shouted back at them to leave him alone, and they all looked back and forth between me and my uncle. Before I could really comprehend everything, the red and blue lights showed up, and my uncle was forcibly pulled out of the car. I became even more scared for my uncle, as no one would listen to me, nor ask me what happened, and I felt like he was being looked at as a bad guy. But even though I was scared and I knew what he said, I couldn't bring myself to be mad at him like everyone else seemed to be. I didn't see Uncle Todd for a long time after that, even though I asked about him pretty frequently. We had a party at our house, and I was ecstatic to finally see him there, and while he seemed like the happy and cheerful uncle that I knew him as, this time it was different. It felt real. He was warm and lighthearted. He was soft-spoken and just all around had that aura to him that anyone would want to be around. I was happy to have him back. It wasn't until many years later that I fully understood the depth of what had happened that day. As it may seem obvious to those of you reading this now, Uncle Todd had been battling some unseen demons and an overwhelming sense of despair that he thought he could escape from that night. One that could have ended tragically for both of us and changed our families' lives forever. Thankfully, he realized that night that he needed help. And, slowly, over the years, he found his way back to being who he wanted to be, the real Todd. And I will always be thankful for that. I don't know if it was something else that he saw or thought about, or if it was just my words that made him turn around that night, but it's something that I will never forget. I used to work the night shift for a 24-hour convenience store in a fairly quiet suburban area. The job was typically uneventful, which is a welcome thing to a 20-year-old college student that needed the work-life balance that I did. I've always sucked at studying, and I'm horribly prone to stress, but since the job was pretty do-nothing most of the time, I was able to get some studying in while sitting behind the counter. The boss didn't really care, as long as the register closed out accurately and the store stayed relatively clean. There was one rainy night in the spring of 2020, though, that I thought something bad was going to happen. I will say that it did end up as one of those stories where nothing really happened, thankfully, but that was pure dumb luck. And if things hadn't gone the exact way they had, it would have been a terrible situation. It was one of those nights where it was coming down in buckets, and it was coming down for pretty much the entire night. It wasn't a violent storm, just one of those early spring storms where it's steady for hours on end. When it started to rain, I immediately knew that this was going to be the perfect night. I had a pretty major midterm coming up and I needed to study for it. And a heavy rain typically meant a dead store. Most people that would come through for their soda and candy in the middle of the night would just stay home, which meant that I had several hours to do absolutely nothing. We had a few brave souls come through, but it was so few that I think we made 3 transactions in just as many hours. A slow night, for sure. Around 2 in the morning, when the rain was starting to slow down a bit, a man entered the store. He was drenched from head to toe, water literally dripping off his coat onto the floor. I know this because I remember as he walked in, I went over to get the wet floor sign in the mop. While I was setting up the sign, he walked over to where I was standing and said, "Hey." It made me jump because I was struggling with the damn clamp on the sign that held it up, and I didn't realize that he'd gotten that close. I apologized for jumping like that and told him that I'd ring him up in a second and that the sign was a pain. Just trying to make a slight joke to ease the tensions. When I glanced up at him, though, he didn't seem to get the humor. His eyes were wide and were darting, and he almost had this nervous energy about him. I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was on something, maybe he was just hopped up on caffeine. It was honestly none of my business. I finished what I was doing and walked back around the counter and looked at him, waiting for him to approach. But he just stood there staring at the sign that I had just put up, and then nervously glancing around the shop. I asked him if he was ready to check out, and he quickly turned his head toward me and stared without saying anything, then turned and walked back to the soda cooler for a second time. I just watched him like, okay, this guy is a bit weird. But again, we got weirdos pretty frequently. After a couple of moments, he walked up to the counter with a bottle of soda, a few candy bars, and a few other various snack items. I scanned the items and tried to make a bit of small talk, mentioning the storm and laughing that he forgot his umbrella. He responded in monosyllables, not even full words for half the conversation, and the whole time he would not look at me. His jumpiness was starting to make me a bit nervous, but again, I just had to accept that he was awkward and move on. As I handed him his change, he suddenly leaned in close enough that I could smell his breath, and whispered, "You shouldn't be here alone." His stare and words sent a chill down my spine, and I just sort of stammered and mumbled that I had a coworker out back, and that they would be back in momentarily. He didn't respond. He just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable few seconds, and then turned to leave. I breathed a sigh of relief when he left, thinking that the situation could have ended badly had he not believed me. A few hours passed, and by the time 4:30 rolled around, I had mostly forgotten about the whole interaction, shrugging it off as just a weird thing that happened. About that time, I was on the main floor sweeping up some of the aisles and making sure the store was tidy and organized so that I could spend my last couple of hours stalking and getting back to my studying before I went home, when I heard the door chime again. I looked up, thinking it was going to be one of our early morning regulars, but my heart sank when I saw that it was him again. This time, he didn't even pretend to shop. He walked straight to the end of the aisle that I was sweeping, standing between myself and the front counter, and looked me dead in the eyes. "You're still here? I told you it's not safe to be alone." His tone was almost accusatory, like he was angry at me for still working. I swear he was giving me this malicious smirk like he was about to commit something terrible. And of course, my main thought was that he was going to attack me and rob the store. I once again stammered out that my coworker was in the back and that they would be out at any moment, hoping to possibly deter him. But I could very clearly see that it wasn't going to work a second time. He just laughed out a cold and hollow sound that made me feel sick. By some miracle or manifestation, as soon as he took a step forward, the door to the back swung open and the morning manager, Jim, stepped toward me, saying, "Hey, morning Morgan, how's the night been?" without looking up and seeing the situation that was unfolding. When Jim stepped out and the man saw him, he looked back at me and shook his head slightly, then quickly left the store, which did catch Jim's attention. He watched the guy walk out of the store, looked up at me, and I was pretty obviously distraught. He asked what that was all about, and I told him that I was pretty certain that that guy was about to rob the store before he walked in. At first, Jim thought I was joking, and he kind of chuckled, but he quickly realized I was being very serious. He asked if he should call the police, and if the guy had actually made any threats or anything. I told him that he was just being aggressive and that he had warned me, saying that I shouldn't be here alone. Which, when I said it, sounded kind of weak and silly. Thankfully, Jim took it seriously. He said that he would get the guy's picture off of the security camera and would let the other managers know that this guy was trouble. He also said that he would talk to the general manager about getting a second person for the overnight shift, because he agreed that one person working the entire shift alone was a recipe for disaster. Thankfully, I never saw the man again, but the event definitely made me feel vulnerable on the overnight shift. The general manager did take Jim's advice, and within a week, we had a second person on the overnight, and every shift from then on had at least 2 people. I know that it cost them more in labor, but it was nice that they realized how serious the situation was. I'm grateful that he wasn't given the opportunity to follow through on his vague threats, but at the same time, I know how much it was dumb luck that saved me that night. If Jim had been running late at all, he would have had the chance to do what he was going to do, and I would have ended up injured or much, much worse. To begin, this happened about 10 years ago, and I've only ever told this to a few people face to face. Most people think it's a tall tale. It was honestly one of the most unsettling things that has ever happened to me, and changed me from a condescending skeptic into somewhat of a believer. Background. When I was a 22-year-old second-year uni student, no drink, no drugs, living in the Stoke area of the UK, I rented an old middle terrace house in second year with my then girlfriend and some friends. It was a creepy dark house, as it only had windows at the front and the back. It had a dingy and damp old basement with lots of old furniture stuffed inside, and a black cat that would show up at the back door every night meowing, which I befriended and fed. It was also creepy because of the dark and muddy cul-de-sac that served as a communal courtyard and car park. All of this didn't bother me, however. I grew up in a pretty creepy old house built in the early 1800s. It did, as I later learned, bother my downstairs housemate and his girlfriend, who heard regular footfalls at night in the highway and adjacent living room, only to find nobody when he would sneak out to look. I also discovered a year after this event that the students who lived there the year prior all believed the house was haunted, and were glad to move out. So, the main story. My term time ended 4 weeks after all of the other tenants, because I had to do clinical placement. This meant I lived in this large house alone, which I loved. I'm an introvert, and I love alone time. It started great. For 2 weeks, I enjoyed it despite the background creepiness. I would just reason away any creepiness as I still do now. However, after the 2-week mark, I became aware of a creeping sense of dread that I couldn't rationalize or find cause for. I'm not an overly anxious person, and I enjoy my own company, and nothing weird had happened. I began to feel very unwelcome, and very much not alone. I felt how a prey animal must feel when they feel eyes on their back. I began to feel so scared that, even in the day, I would take the 3-mile walk onto campus and sit and work in the library if not on placement. I would come home and be afraid. I even devised a system for moving around the house at night without ever being in an unlit area. I also did this during the day in the windowless areas. I had to move from my large comfy room into the smallest bedroom, lock the door, and sleep with my back to a wall, often with the light on. I was inexplicably afraid. On the final day, I had to lock all the windows, turn off all the plugs, and get some stuff from the basement and lock the back door before I left. I was utterly terrified, and I felt like I was moving in slow motion the entire time. I went around systematically ensuring that a light was always on, and that I wasn't in darkness. I'd piled all my stuff, backpack and duffel bag. The rest was mercifully packed in my car the day before, at the front door. This is where it gets really scary, and I cannot explain what happened adequately. It was late afternoon and still light outside, but the house was dark. I steeled myself to turn the hallway light off, but the light switch was about 4 meters from the front door at the foot of the stairs. It was night dark upstairs, which was normal because no windows and all the doors shut. I turned the light off and scurried away without turning my back to the stairs. The daylight still lit the hallway from the open front door, but as I got to the door, the strangest thing happened. My neck hairs stood on end. To my shame, if I needed to pee at the time, I think I would have peed myself. I could feel, or see, I can't really explain, a black and viscous, shadowy cloud slowly making its way down the stairs towards me. I felt such malevolence. I basically tripped backwards into the street and into daylight, shut the door, and everything felt fine. Like nothing had just happened. I locked the door and posted the key through the letterbox and have never seen the house again. The only way I can explain the feeling is to liken it to a Dementor and Ringwraith attack. Except there wasn't a caped humanoid figure chasing me. I couldn't see it, but I knew. The fear and dread was indescribable, and I have never since experienced anything like it. I had, nor have, no mental health issues. I was happy and not stressed at the time, etc. I even feel crazy and embarrassing relating the story. Are there any other experiences like this? Hi. I was hoping that someone on here could give me some advice. Because frankly, I've gone from worried to terrified in the last few nights. I haven't been one for believing in the supernatural, but at this point, I don't know what else it could be. I have brought this up with my family, and they laugh it off like it's nothing, only reminding me that this is just like I'm a child again. I apologize for any spelling issues, as I wasn't very good with that kind of stuff in school. Some backstory. I'm 25, male, and I was self-employed as a joiner. I guess handyman to you Americans. Unfortunately, I had a stroke back in April. Until then, I was perfectly healthy, but due to work stress and a family gene linked to them, I had a bad one. This is all just context to why I recently moved back in with my grandparents. My rent wasn't cheap, and myself and my partner couldn't afford to keep living there without my income, so we decided until I'm better that we'll move back in with our families. It really sucks, and I wish that she was with me right now through all of this. So, last month, with the help of my brother and father, we moved me and my dog into my grandparents' fairly large house in the countryside. They have 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a large living room upstairs and downstairs. The kitchen, the dining room, the living room, another bathroom, and down a small corridor at the back of the house, 2 more bedrooms. It was basically like living in an apartment myself, without the worry of being in people's way, as my grandparents don't come downstairs unless it's to go shopping or for food. Now this is where things started to go from bad to worse. About a week ago, I caught what we think was the norovirus, and due to my current health, it unfortunately floored me. I was horribly sick and feeling tired all the time, and just losing my will to live. So I would take comfort in the times that I could sleep. In sleeping, though, I started to have this nightmare. I was lying in the bed in my room, and I could feel like someone or something was watching me from the corner of the room closest to the window. I couldn't see anything actually there, but I know that something was. It unsettled me. It was like a stranger following you late at night, and you don't know their intentions. This keeps happening. Each sleep, the feeling was there. In the last 2 nights, it's gotten worse. Saturday night was the first time that I caught a glimpse of it. Like a man. A really tall man made of pure darkness. Like Vanta Black in the heart of an abyss dark. He was standing in the corner of the room where I felt like someone was watching me. I felt like the entire dream was only a few seconds long. I saw him and woke up immediately drenched in sweat. When I finally calmed myself down, I went upstairs to my grandparents' living room. I waited until they got up and I had a chat with them about my dream. When I told my grandma about it, she laughed and said that I sounded like I was 5 years old again, talking about the scary monster in my dreams. The same scary monster. How, as a kid, I would complain whenever I slept here because there was a scary man watching me, until I refused to sleep over. Hearing all this scared the living daylights out of me, and it makes me want to leave, but I have nowhere else to go. My grandparents' house is the only family that had space for me and my German Shepherd. Last night, I was determined to keep myself awake all night, and maybe find a friend's sofa to accidentally fall asleep on. However, it hit 4 a.m. and I couldn't prevent myself from sleeping any longer, and I crashed. In my dream from last night, the man was moving, reaching out for me. You know when you have that feeling like you're in a dangerous situation? Like standing too close to a cliff's edge? I felt like that. Like whatever this thing was, I could not let it touch me, or something very bad would happen. I'm not sure what, but something very bad. In my dream, I rolled over the bed and half stumbled into the door with a slam, as it was inches away from touching me. In the moment I slammed into the door, I woke up in the exact same position that I was in my dream, with the exception that my dog was now there, hackles up, and growling angrily in the direction that thing was in when I was asleep. This all but confirms to me that this thing isn't just in my head. I don't know what to do, or where to go next. I'm kind of scared that I'm going to die. Does anyone know what this is, or how I can protect myself? Please, can someone help me? Update. I appreciate everyone's support here. My best mate let me take his couch last night, and I had the best night's sleep that I've had in a while. Unfortunately, it's only temporary, as he's getting ready to go offshore again and his partner will be home from her holiday on Friday. I've taken a lot of your advice, and I've booked an appointment with my local GP. However, the earliest appointment wasn't until the 20th. I reached out locally to a woman that my friend swears could cleanse the room, too. And she'll be able to stop by Thursday afternoon. I hope all the things that I've taken will help me move on from this. I just don't know if this truly is in my head, or if it's something more. I'll let you guys know what happens in a couple of days. Thank you all again. I have a creepy and sad story that I'm going to try and not make too long, about something that happened to me that freaked me the hell out, and it happened last month. Where I live, October and November are when we get most of our rain for the second half of the year. We have pretty hot and dry summers, and then when fall and winter hits, we have mild temperatures and a lot of wet days. You can pretty much depend on October to be an umbrella month, and if you leave home without it, you'll be sorry. I recently moved into a new townhome on a small property on the edge of town. It's a nice little place, and I'm surrounded by a lot of retired people, so I love it, because they tend to not bother me. The townhome, while quaint, does have a bit of an eerie feeling to it, and I think the majority of that eeriness comes from the fact that they didn't install many lights. Most of the rooms do not have overhead lights, they just have an abundance of outlets for lamps. Unfortunately, I don't have very many lamps yet, so my place is pretty dark. When it gets dark outside, like during the stormy season, it is pretty creepy. Plus, the building is a bit older, so there's some give to the strong winds and a leak above the window in the living room. But that's an annoyance, not a creepy thing. I was in my living room listening to music and just doom-scrolling on my phone when I heard my doorbell ring. I was a bit confused as to why someone would be at my door, especially out in the rain like this, and at first I thought about just ignoring it, thinking they would go away. I'm not a very social person, to be completely honest with you. After the second doorbell ring, I got up and opened the door anyways, assuming it was one of my neighbors, and I really didn't want to be too much of an a-hole. I opened up to see an older lady that I knew as Betty standing there, drenched in the rain and just staring at me, with these empty eyes. It was a bit strange. We hadn't really spoken beyond passing hellos, and she looked like she was a bit out of it, like she was sleepwalking, almost. I asked what she was doing out in the rain in a joking way, but she just stared at me for a moment, and honestly looked rather somber, like she was really upset. I leaned in a bit and I asked her if she was okay, if I could help her with anything. She very quietly said, "I need help." I told her okay, that I would help her, and then asked her what she needed help with. She turned and just pointed to the townhome that she lived in, keeping that same somber look and not speaking. After a second, I just nodded and said, "Okay, yeah, I can come over. Let me just get my shoes and my jacket, and we can go over there. Why don't you step inside and get out of the rain?" I said this and turned away from my door, walking into the hallway to grab my shoes and slipped them on. When I turned back to my door, she was gone. I was a bit confused. She was just there, and I hadn't taken more than 5 to 10 seconds to slip my shoes on. They were slip-on shoes. They didn't even have strings. I stepped back to the door to see if she'd started walking back towards her unit, but she wasn't outside at all. She was nowhere to be found. I stared off into the rain thinking, where the hell did she go? There was no way that she could have gotten to her unit and gotten inside in the time it took me to put on my shoes. She was rather elderly, and she was slow-moving and walked with a walker. It was then that I realized that I didn't see her walker when she was at my door. I knew that she needed it, so for her to not have it, and to be there, was a bit weird. I figured that maybe she'd somehow made it from my step back to her place while I was turned away. Maybe I had taken a bit longer to put my shoes on than I thought. I walked out into the rain and over to her unit and knocked on the door waiting for an answer. But she didn't. I rang the doorbell, still nothing. I was so confused, thinking I had just seen this little old lady at my front door. There was no way that she could have sprinted away from my door and gotten off the property in time that it took me to put my shoes on. I peered in her window to see if maybe I was just losing my mind, and when I did, I freaked out. I saw her. She was sitting in her chair in the living room, but she was slumped over, and she was pretty obviously gone. I could tell that she wasn't breathing, and that's when it hit me that what I saw at my door was not Betty. It was Betty's spirit. And that's why she was so quiet. That's why she didn't have her walker. And that's how she managed to disappear so quickly. And that's why she asked me for help, because she'd passed away, and she was worried that no one was going to notice. I don't know why she chose me, but she did. And I had to do what I could for her. I called 911 and explained to them that I'd had an elderly neighbor that I thought had passed away from what I could see in her window. It was a bit strange to explain, but I told them that, from where I was, it looked like she might be gone. They told me that they would send an ambulance to do a check, and when I hung up from that call, I called the emergency maintenance number for the property. I told the maintenance person that I had an ambulance coming and explained that we were going to need to get into Betty's place. Again, it was a bit awkward to explain who I was and why I was asking, but I mentioned that I could see her from her window and that I thought she'd passed away, and he said he would be there to help out the paramedics if they needed. Long story short, the paramedics got there, the maintenance tech showed up, and he let them into her unit because, from what he saw, it did look like she was deceased. Sure enough, the paramedics entered and confirmed what we'd thought. She'd fallen asleep in her chair and had passed away. I stuck around to answer their questions, but I didn't tell them that her spirit had come to my door or anything. I told them that I'd come over to see her and knocked on her door, and when she didn't answer, I looked in the window and saw her. Thankfully, that was enough to satiate them, as they could tell that there was no foul play involved. So, that's my story of the one rainy night, literally last month, where my neighbor's spirit decided to come over and let me know that she was gone, and asked me to help her out. I would have to guess that the reason was because she thought she wouldn't be found for a while. Like I said, it's a very quiet and rather reserved neighborhood. I'm glad that I could help her out after she'd gone, and hopefully she's able to rest peacefully. I grew up in a very loving, yet unique household. At least, in my opinion. I was adopted, but many people would say that it was a weird time for my parents to do so. They're pretty well set in life. My father owns an accounting firm that was passed down to him by my grandfather, and my mom became part of that family and embraced it well. They adopted me when I was 3, and I know people have made many comments about it to them, and to me, because they adopted me when they were in their 50s. This was not a situation of a kid or a family member having a child that they couldn't take care of either. They went through all the legal motions to adopt a kid, and even mentioned how they had some difficulties due to their age. But eventually, they won, and I'm forever grateful for that. But I also wasn't the only child. They have a son, a biological son, named Danny, and there was a 15-year difference between us. When they were going through the motions of adoption, my brother, their son, had just graduated from high school. He was still living at home and wasn't attending college as he was still trying to decide what he wanted to do. So while I did get to know him as I grew up, we weren't close enough to really play together or bond. It was like he was another adult or family member, but nonetheless, I still treated him like my brother and called him as such, because he was all I had. However, he did not seem to feel the same about me. While he didn't outwardly express it to me, he made it obvious to my parents, and I eventually heard about it as I got older. Unfortunately, that's how this story came to be. My parents truly did treat us equally. They supported us both, celebrated our accomplishments, grieved with us when we were upset, and even both got in trouble for the bad things, even though he was a young adult. He was still living under their roof, after all. However, I could always feel a sense of anger or jealousy from Danny. He never wanted to attend any of my school functions or plays, or any of my baseball games, which was pretty disheartening. My parents did their best to not make me feel so bad about it, and it typically worked. So, as I got older, with a good support system including my parents and family, who all loved and accepted me, thankfully, as well as my friends, I excelled in just about everything I did. I did great in school, and I already had ideas of what I wanted to do after I finished high school. And no, my intentions were not to work under my father in his accounting firm. I wanted to major in graphic design and business management, hoping to run my own business. That, of course, was inspired by my parents, as I wanted to be my own boss. I took all the extra classes that would help me get there, and I loved it. So, fast forward here, I was in my senior year of high school and, of course, was still living at home, and my brother Danny, now 32, had a place of his own. I was on our holiday break and was helping my parents prepare for Thanksgiving dinner. I helped my mom bake the pies the night prior and even helped my dad stock up on firewood so we could have the fireplace prepared. Our Thanksgiving was typically pretty small. It was usually just the 4 of us. Sometimes Danny would bring a girl with him that he was seeing at the time, and some of our neighbors would stop by, and my mom would exchange sweets with them. I loved our neighbor's pumpkin roll. The next Friday, the 3 of us would go over to my aunt's to have a bigger dinner with them and my grandparents when they were around. So this year was no different. It started with the 3 of us, and Danny showed up later, but this time, he was later than usual. My mom had become a bit upset with him as he hadn't even bothered to call and tell her, and these holidays were always very important to her. I mean, he's known her longer than me, so he should understand that, but he still didn't seem to care. When he finally arrived, my mom gave him one of her stern talkings, but then we all carried on. I tried talking to him on a few occasions and asked how he was doing, and he always just gave me these short answers and never offered the same. So, I never talked about myself to him. I had also noticed that he seemed to be on edge that evening. He would give short answers to my parents, and just seemed to be close to going off on someone the entire time. We finally got to dinner, and the dining room was set up to where you could see the TV in the living room from the table. My parents often left it on, especially on Thanksgiving, as my dad liked to watch the game. Surprisingly, Danny and I had that in common. Neither one of us liked football. But I was thankful that it was on because, otherwise, it would have been too quiet that day. They both still paid attention to the conversation, though, and thankfully my dad wasn't the type to shout at the TV from the table. The conversation started fine. My mom asked how Danny was doing and what he was up to. He learned that he'd had quite a thing for antique cars recently, and he was talking about opening his own car shop that specialized in antique cars. And my parents were supportive of that too. At the time, he was just working at a different shop and was going to some kind of school to learn about it, like a community college, I think it was. My mom asked how it was going, and I just remember him constantly complaining about it. He said that he hated the owners that he worked under, and the guys that he worked with were all jerks. He said that he didn't like his professor as he felt like he was targeting him, and how some of the assignments seemed irrelevant. Yet, my mom was always the optimistic type, and she tried her best to find some positive things about it. My dad even said that he was proud of him for still sticking with it, and that after he finished school, if he was still serious about it, he would go in on a loan to get him the property that he needed. When I heard this, I thought it was really cool, as it also seemed to loosen him up a bit too. I then joked, saying that I could help him set up his website and create a banner for him due to my work in exchange for a family discount on car repairs, because I did have an old used car at the time. He snapped at me, saying that he didn't need my help. My mom immediately told him to be nice because I was just trying to be helpful, but the damage was already done. I was upset, but I did my best to stay upbeat for the sake of my parents. However, it only seemed to get worse when my parents asked about my plans after school. I was keeping it a surprise for Christmas, but I thought maybe to lighten the mood I would go ahead and share it early. I told them how I had found a college that I wanted to go to, as it had a great graphic and web design program, and I had already completed the pre-enrollment process. There was a test that you had to take for acceptance, and I'd passed it all. I just had to complete the last part of the enrollment, and I was set. And they also had apartments that you could include in your tuition that were in the area. They weren't quite dorms, as they were bigger, and based on the pictures, they were actual apartments. So I was pretty excited to have my own place. So I told them about it. The light in my parents' eyes was enough to fill me with happiness again. My mom gave her little high-pitched voice and said how happy she was, and my dad said that he was proud of me and again offered to help me with my tuition. I was incredibly thankful for them and felt loved, but the happy feeling wouldn't last. Danny scoffed at me and said, "Okay, it's just a pre-assessment. You still have to be approved to get in." To which I corrected him, saying that I was approved. I was just under 18, so I didn't have an acceptance letter yet. They even explained that to me. He then laughed and said that that's not how the real world worked, and called me naive. I know it probably wasn't the right thing to do, but I was getting pretty upset. Everyone talked about him and congratulated him, but when it came to me, I was never good enough for him, and I never understood why. I told him, "Do you want me to get the letter to prove it?" And he responded by saying that he didn't need some kid trying to prove him wrong. My parents were trying to get us to stop, but I was already pretty annoyed, and I felt the need to stand up for myself and my parents. "What is your problem with me, Danny?" I said angrily as I sat in my seat. "My problem? You are the problem. I don't even know why you're here. You're not even part of this family. They just brought you in out of pity because your drugged-up mother left you to die." I remember the words like it had just happened, because it still hurts. I knew I was adopted. My parents never tried to hide it from me, but they never made me feel like I was second best or unloved. I knew they loved me. But now I finally knew for certain. It was finally clear what I had always feared. Danny never loved me, let alone even liked me. And I tried hard for his approval. My dad yelled at him for what he said to me, but I just told them that I was okay and that I would like to be excused. I got up and started towards my room, even as my mom pleaded for me to stay. As I put my plate in the sink and started walking away, Danny continued to mock me, saying more hurtful things, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I know this last part was my fault, but I'd been pushed to my limit. You know, Danny, maybe they adopted me because they wanted a second chance at a successful son. That was the first time that I had ever heard my mom say my name in a negative tone. I knew I was in trouble, but I really didn't care. But as I walked down the hall, I heard the sound of a chair scrape across the floor and heavy footsteps coming towards me. Then I heard my parents shouting for Danny. I barely turned around when I was met with his fist to my face. I collapsed to the floor and he proceeded to punch me a few more times in the face, and that was probably the worst pain that I'd ever experienced. I remember crying, or maybe trying to, and I heard my parents yelling at him before I finally blacked out. I woke up shortly after as my mom was trying to clean my face up. I was a mess. They took me to the hospital because I definitely needed stitches in my scalp, and unfortunately, because I was still a minor, they had to file a report. My brother was arrested, but none of us pressed charges, even when I was asked. I chose not to. My father really considered it too, but I think deep down he didn't want to either. I had a long talk with my parents who told me that I shouldn't have said what I said, and I agreed, and apologized to them because I knew it wasn't true. They weren't disappointed at him, but for some reason, he seemed to think that. And I knew that they loved me and were proud of me too, but I just couldn't take his hateful comments anymore. This was 2 years ago, and I've only seen my brother briefly twice since. Once when my mom had knee surgery, and once when he stopped by their place to pick up some of his mail while I was visiting. I still go home to visit them for holiday breaks, but he never comes. They go out and have dinner with him instead. I even apologized to him for what I said, and all he said in return was, "Okay." So, not even an apology from him. I don't even know if he is sorry. Anyways, this was my crazy family story. Even though it wasn't too scary, it was scary enough for me knowing what my brother did to me, as a minor while he was a full-fledged adult. I still hope that one day we may have a normal brotherly relationship, but until then, I guess I'll just pretend that I was an only child. So, I'm the fourth-generation owner of a small farmhouse built in the late 1800s. My great-grandparents bought it sometime around 1920. At that time, there weren't really many houses built in the area, and there were no paved roads. An old graveyard, still in use today, is on the ridge above us. The family, through all these years, have claimed that the house is haunted, but that the ghost is friendly, so no one has ever been afraid. Backstory to the ghost is that it's perhaps the spirit of a man wrongly accused, late 1800s before my family, of theft. A man's wallet had been stolen, and footprints led to this house, where a man was found sleeping in the woods. The story tells that the man was promptly strung up in an elm tree in the corner yard where he died. The tree continued to stand until last year when we cut it down due to too many dead and dangerous limbs. I will add here that my great-grandfather was chopped into many pieces by a train in the mid-1960s, and his wife died here in the early 70s. But evidently the ghost story precedes these events. There have been many witnesses over the years to a loud slam that happens from time to time that seems to be in the basement, which is a dugout. But when checked, the basement door is padlocked. The slam can even be heard over the phone by people on the other end of the call. We, too, keep the door padlocked, but we experience the slam from time to time. There's someone whistling a tune just outside a window, with, of course, no one there, is another tale, though no one other than my great-grandma ever heard this. Until me. I lived in the house for a short time 40 years ago, and during this time I heard someone whistling a particular tune that was a fond memory for me. A friend used it as a signal for me to sneak out of the house on our summer nights when I was a teen. I checked, no one there. So, I told my mom about it, naming the Civil War era tune. She had a strange look on her face and told me that she'd forgotten this was the very song that my great-grandma claimed to have heard. While she had told me about her having heard the whistling, she had never related the tune to me. Mom was quite jealous, actually, that I'd heard it. Many years passed. The house was rented out for a couple of decades or so, and then was basically abandoned and left to ruin for a period of several years. I came in about 5 years ago and restored both house and yard, which was a terrible, brambled-up mess. 2 weeks of serious work was needed in the yard before we started inside. During this time, my boyfriend and myself often heard a very loud, clear whistling of old-fashioned tunes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as it sounded the same from all areas of the yard. We would search for the source, a neighbor in their yard perhaps, but there was never a soul around us. Weird, but not scary. We hired a man to help us do the interior work. Walls and ceilings all had to be replaced, everything gone but wall bones and a roof. One afternoon, he stepped out for a break. He stepped back in to ask who was whistling so beautifully. My boyfriend and I laughed and told him about the ghost. He said that we were BSing him and went for his own investigation. He ended up leaving for the day a believer in, and scared of, the ghost. We remained friends after the job was done, and he's always wary of the house noises when he visits. It's funny, really. But now. I had ordered some trial creams for after bathing. Hang with me here. It was a 15-day trial that arrived on a very large, 10x5 folded card, with small pouches that held 2 packets for each day. It was large, thick, visible. I used it for 3 days. My boyfriend and I share the same vanity in which I stored the card. He was familiar with it. The 4th day, it was gone. This very large card is nowhere. We turned the bathroom upside down, cleaned and reorganized everything in the entire bathroom. Gone. I searched again the next week, tweaking my organization, hoping in vain to find the large card. I was proud of my clean bathroom, but no large card. I opened the vanity 2 days ago, and there it is, front and center. I called my boyfriend in, simply pointed, and he, having already seen it, said, "I know, right? Where'd you find it?" I've given it much thought, I'm not being ridiculous. I did not overlook it, and it was not there. But here it is, front and center. My boyfriend has no guile, and I completely believe he is innocent of this being a possible prank. He's laughing about the matter, sort of. But he appears to think that I'm making too much out of it. I think he's worrying about my mental health, or possibly Alzheimer's. I'm 60. All I know is it was there. It disappeared for a week, and then it was there. Just to note, I'm retired and always home. Boyfriend is semi-retired, works 20 hours, or is otherwise home. We have only rare visitors who are directed to the guest bath. No one would have had access to the room, much less been interested in such an inconsequential item in order to play a prank. I hadn't spoken of the creams to anyone but my boyfriend. Has my ghost moved it up a notch to poltergeist? Or am I suffering dementia? Edit to add, there was another incident where I lived here 40 years ago. Two friends were visiting. There was a not loud but very audible noise in the next room. We all heard it. It sounded like someone was pulling a heavy couch, perhaps along the wood flooring. But there was no one there. They left, believers and scared. But again, it did not scare me. Every time around this time of year, there is an event that comes back to the front of my mind. There are a few people from the family that are reminded of it by others, while some of us crack jokes about it now. I'm sure it definitely wasn't funny at the time, but now it's a way for some of us to get past it. Humor can be healing, right? As a child, I remembered our family always having a pretty extensive Thanksgiving. My grandparents had a nice-sized house, and they would always host it. My parents, my two siblings, and I would always be there, as well as plenty of aunts and uncles and cousins. I had a lot of cousins close to my age, so I always had plenty of kids around to play with too. I was probably 10 at the time of this event. In fact, I had just turned 10 the month prior, in October. There was also one uncle specifically that I loved being around, Uncle Rob. He was very friendly and was the type to listen to you no matter your age, and was always engaged in the conversation, saying he was proud of you, excited for you, things like that. I knew the grandparents of the house we were at were my mom's parents because she always called them Mom and Pops. But I remember asking if Uncle Rob was Mom's brother or Dad's brother. At the time, I was curious because they both called him by his name, but still hugged him and treated him as a brother. But at the time, my older brother and younger sister both called me Bubba, so being a kid, I was confused why they didn't call him that. Their answer was kind of ambiguous at first. They said he wasn't really the brother to either of them, but that he was like a brother, and explained in a way how he was kind of adopted into the family. They also asked me not to mention it to anyone as it could hurt someone's feelings. I agreed, and never really thought anything more of it. I never thought of him any differently. And he also had a son, my cousin Dylan. And he was one of my favorite cousins. He's about 2 or 3 years older than I was, and was still interested in the same things, such as the Pokemon card game. So I looked at him as someone cool and often hung out with him when we worked together. So on this Thanksgiving, we all started arriving. We were one of the first ones there, and my mom helped with a lot of the cooking. Shortly after everyone else got there, all of us kids were playing in the back living room, while most of the adults were sprinkled around the kitchen and living rooms. As usual, it was a great time. All of us kids talked, made up games, and played with some of the toys and setups our grandparents kept around for us, and we would randomly hear the adults talking and laughing too. Amidst the chatter of the house, it seemed to get quieter on the adult side of things. I didn't hear a lot of people shouting or laughing, and I got curious. I told my cousins that I would be back and walked towards the kitchen to get a drink, which was an easy enough ruse to give myself a reason to check on what was going on. While standing in the kitchen, I could hear the music that my grandma had turned on earlier, something we couldn't hear because of how loud the house had gotten. But even more curious was the conversation that I was hearing, and a raspy, slurred voice that I couldn't place. The conversation definitely was not a happy one, and I once again wanted to see what was going on. I approached the doorway to the living room where my Uncle Rob was blocking it. I managed to duck under him a bit, and I saw a woman standing by the front door. She had on a very short dress and sneakers, with a thick, fluffy coat hanging off her shoulders. But there was a very weird feeling in the air. It was like anger and fear. It was a very similar feeling to when I did something bad and my parents yelled at me, middle name and all. But it wasn't towards me. I could tell that it was for this strange woman. Now, this may not be exactly the conversation since it has been several years since this event, but between what I remember and what my parents have told me, this is what I heard. My grandpa was the first person that I heard talking to the woman at the door, and he sounded very angry. It was not a tone that I was used to hearing from him. He told her that she wasn't supposed to be there, which seemed to make the woman angry. Why not? Why can't I see my family? I want to see my son. My grandpa responded angrily, but keeping his voice low. You've been given chances time and time again, Margaret. We can't keep doing this. It's not fair to us, and it's not fair to Dylan. I just want to have Thanksgiving with my family. Why is he allowed to be here but not me? I'm your daughter, Arthur, she yelled as she pointed at my Uncle Rob. I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't know who this woman was, but she was claiming to be my grandpa's daughter. I knew all of my mom's siblings. Even if we weren't close, I could still name them all off. And she was not on that list. Why did she seem so angry at my Uncle Rob? My grandpa started yelling at her that she was not allowed there anymore until she was clean, and told her that she needed to leave before he called the cops. My mom then approached the woman, but I could see the sadness in her eyes as she shuffled her out the front door. After she left, and my mom came back in, the atmosphere still felt tense, until my grandma said something to lighten the mood. Thankfully, it didn't take long before everyone loosened up, and we were all back to having fun again. When my mom realized I was there, she pulled me to the side and made me promise to not mention the situation that I witnessed to Uncle Rob, and especially not to Dylan, to which I agreed. Once the celebration was back into full swing, we started smelling something funny. At this point in the night, I had gone to the front living room and was watching TV with my grandmother, and she hollered for someone to check the stove because she could smell something burning. I started to smell it too, but I remember it being something specific that I couldn't quite pinpoint. One of my uncles came into the living room and confirmed the stove was not on, but then his face twisted and confirmed what we were smelling. It was wood. Almost like what we would smell when we had a bonfire, but it also had a chemical smell to it, what I now recognize as the smell of treated wood burning. Many of the adults started looking concerned, and were looking around the house frantically, doing a head count on all the kids. Then my dad came back in from the front door, and was telling us all to get out. As the adults grabbed all of us kids, we all ran out, and that's when I saw the smoke. The sun was setting, but I could still see the dark smoke billowing into the sky. The fire trucks showed up quickly and put out the fire before significant damage was done. The fire had started by the garage and spread to the spare bedroom behind it that was just being used as storage. The rest of that night was a blur, as I felt like I slept in spurts. We all were there pretty late. My parents were talking to a lot of cops and walking around the house. After some time, my dad took us kids home and my mom stayed there. Over the next few days, things calmed down and life seemed to continue as normal, other than a few extra trips to my grandparents because my dad helped fix up their house. I kept my promise, and even though I was very curious about that incident, I never asked or mentioned it to anyone. It wasn't until years later that I was finally let in on the details of that day and how we got there. The mystery lady, Margaret, is actually my aunt, my mom's youngest sister, and my Uncle Rob was her ex-husband, making Dylan her son. My Aunt Margaret had an issue with drugs, and she met my Uncle Rob when she was trying to get clean. He was apparently a huge asset in keeping her sober, and they ended up getting married and having Dylan. However, shortly after Dylan was born, she seemed to relapse, and she was putting the three of them in dangerous situations. So, with my grandparents' support, Uncle Rob told her that she needed to get clean again or that they would get a divorce and that he would take Dylan. She responded to this by trying to stab my Uncle Rob while Dylan slept in his room nearby. Obviously, she was unsuccessful and went away for some time, but apparently, that time did not sober her up. Uncle Rob didn't have much in the way of his own biological family, so he was accepted into our family with open arms. And that's why my mom always just explained that he was adopted by us. So when my Aunt Margaret showed up at that Thanksgiving, obviously under the influence of something, she was told to leave. And, once again, she took revenge by setting the house on fire. They easily found evidence supporting this, and she went away for several more years. As far as I know, from those in my family that I do keep in contact with, no one has heard from her in years. My mom says that she still feels bad for her, but she's also aware and understands that she keeps putting herself in these situations. It was really scary at the time, thinking that my aunt, this woman that I'd never met, was willing to set her parents' house on fire, while it was filled with her family, and even her son, just out of anger. And while I really don't care to meet her at this point in my life, I do hope that she's at least okay and possibly gotten better. And, hopefully, has never tried to do something so violent to another person again. In 2006, I went on a choir tour of Spain and France. The tour started in Madrid and ended in the Aquitaine region and Toulouse. This experience happened in Lourdes, France. Already in Spain, I was having many deja vu experiences and memories of past life recall. One of the strangest experiences was visiting the Cathedral of Burgos and being able to talk with a tour guide with complete familiarity about the church. At the end of the tour, she said, "You know a lot." I even took some of our group who didn't do the paid tour back the next day and did the entire thing exactly as she done it the day before. But the most unequivocal paranormal experience happened in Lourdes. Lourdes is a small town in southwest France that is famous for Saint Bernadette, a teenage shepherdess who had visions of the Virgin Mary in 1858. On our first day in Lourdes, our tour guide told us about how it had been a Roman outpost before Christianity, with a temple to the water goddess. This is important, because all of the imagery in Lourdes is water imagery. There is a huge tank of water to be dunked in to heal the sick. Everywhere you look, there are bottles in the shape of the Virgin Mary. Your travel through the town is constantly interrupted by streams and rivers of people. You get the idea. Sick Catholics flock to Lourdes for pilgrimage and healing. It's extremely common to see groups of people in wheelchairs and even on stretchers at the site. Especially the grotto where Bernadette had her visions, and on top of which the Church of Lourdes is built. This is the main pilgrimage site. Although I'm not Catholic, the tour guide had piqued my curiosity and I decided to go down to the grotto to vibe it out. In front of the grotto was an empty space followed by 5 or 6 rows of benches, with more empty space behind it. All of this was fenced in. When I got there, I wasn't able to go into the grotto because it was the designated time for stretchers. The benches in the center were full, but there was a bench at the very back against the fence, where I decided to sit and wait. The minute I sat down, I began to feel a buzzing that only got stronger and stronger. The energy was so strong that it pushed my head down towards my knees, so that I looked like I was genuflecting. Through the buzz, I heard this voice say, "You will see where Bernadette saw the lady for the very first time." As usual, I was skeptical, but I took it under consideration. At around this time, the stretchers moved out of the area, and people started lining up from the benches to the center. I moved at those center benches, starting at the left corner until it filled up. As it did so, I slid down the bench until I was sitting at the far right corner of it. Once there, I thought maybe I should say some kind of oblation, so I started singing the choral version of Ave Maria, which we were singing on the tour, in my head. As I did so, the buzzing vibration became overwhelming and I started silently crying. The entire bench held space for me while I cried without ever speaking to or touching me. After I finished crying, I knew that I didn't need to go to the grotto. I had had my Lourdes grotto experience. When I reached down to get my backpack, I saw a bronze plaque on the ground which said, "This is where Saint Bernadette saw the Virgin Mary for the first time, on the 11th of February 1858. I'd been sitting on that spot the entire time. I have a semi-interesting story. For as long as I can remember, I've always had extremely vivid dreams, to the point of not being able to tell my real life from my sleeping one. As I got older, some of these dreams started to become premonitions. Some have come true weeks or even years later. For example, 2 years prior to moving to another province, I had a dream about myself sitting in a small shack, legs up on a desk, looking at a fence with a giant truck coming in. I was wearing a construction onesie, all blue, jumper, high-vis straps, steel-toed boots, and a hard hat. I was 20 at the time of this dream and in my club and super girly mode. No way in hell would you ever catch me in that outfit. Lo and behold, 2 years later, I moved to Alberta. I start working in a refinery and I'm sitting at the desk, feet up, and a truck pulls in, and my dream hits me like a slap to the face. Now to start the real story. I have to preface this with, at this point in time, I had only ever dreamt of my childhood home, obviously my safe space, as I lived in 5 homes after this and never dreamt of any of them. This dream happened in Alberta, in a house that I had only lived in at the time for roughly 6 months. I lived with my boyfriend at the time and his younger brother. We also had 2 cats and a dog. We lived in a 3-floor townhouse. Bedrooms upstairs, the stairway was in the kitchen. Back about 10 feet from the base of the stairs was the back door to our parking spot, and the living room entrance opposite the back door but off to the side of the kitchen. So I go to bed, and the dream starts with my walking down the stairs into my kitchen. There's a pasta pot on the front burner of the stove, and it's on fire. I freak out because I have nothing to stop the fire. I wake up from my dream, walk out of my bedroom, look down the stairs, and the kitchen lights off. No lights at all coming from downstairs, so I go back to bed and I fall asleep. At some point, I fall back into the same dream. I'm walking down the stairs to my kitchen. The pasta pot is on the stove again, but now the entire stove and wall behind it are on fire. I can feel the heat on my face. I panic, trying to wake everyone up as my boyfriend is asleep upstairs. His brother is asleep in the basement. I'm trying to locate my animals, but I can't find anyone or anything. I wake up again, this time way more frazzled. I walk out to the top of the stairs again, and all is still normal. I go to the bathroom and try to shake off the feeling of terror from the dream. I eventually fall back asleep, only to fall back into that same dream for a third time. Now, this time I was walking down the stairs, and I can see before the base of it that the entirety of my kitchen is on fire. Red-hot flames are licking all the walls, black smoke everywhere. It hurts to breathe, and it's hot as hell. I get into the kitchen to see the same pasta pot on the stove. The wall of fire is blocking the living room door entrance, and my dog is on the other side of it barking like crazy. I can't get to him. As I hit the floor, the stairs behind me were also set ablaze with both of my cats at the top of the stairs hollering. I can't save anyone. I want to run to open the back door as that's the only safe route to go, but my brain is like, oxygen will blow the house up. What do I do? I woke up, sweating buckets, crying my eyes out. I leave my room to go check out the kitchen, and now there's a light on. I freak out, and I run downstairs. Guess what I find? My stovetop is on, with the pasta pot on the front burner. All of the water had boiled off, and it had started to turn red. My boyfriend's little brother came home drunk from the club and tried to make food, but passed out in his room. My mom thinks it was my great aunt protecting me as she had just passed earlier that year. Part of me thinks that I also may have some natural abilities for this, as it's happened in the past, but never that instantly. Any insights or similar stories? I have a story about a night a couple of years ago that was a pretty chilling experience. And not just because it was a cold and rainy night. It was the middle of September, which meant the temp was trying to get a little lower, but it was still the end of summer, so it wasn't anything more than light jacket weather. Due to some circumstances mostly out of my control, I no longer had a car, and was reliant on public transportation for pretty much everything, which was a pain because I worked from 10 to 9 at my job, and the bus here was very prompt. So I needed to get out of work on time and make a dash to the bus stop to get to the bus, or else I would have to wait quite a while for the next one. On this particular night, I actually got out of work at 9:10 p.m., and I knew right away that there was no way I was making the next bus, so I was walking slowly in the rain to the bus stop and feeling a bit ticked off at the world. I was moody back then. Cut me some slack, I was still pretty young. I sat there at the bus stop, messing with my phone and thinking about plugging in my earphones to listen to some music and pass the time, when I heard something that sounded like a slight groaning sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, or something like that with how faint it was, but then it happened a second time, and at that point I realized that it wasn't. My curiosity was piqued, because it was definitely some kind of groaning, and it was a bit weird to hear. I stepped off the sidewalk and over to the end of the street, where there were some trees and brush. Initially, I thought it was just some drunk guy that had passed out in the bushes, and I was kind of laughing to myself like, damn dude, you chose a bad night to get hammered and sleep outside. But as I got closer, the groaning got louder, and it sounded less like they were drunk, and more like they were in pain. I followed it to a pretty thick part of the brush, and was shocked by what I saw. It was a man, which I anticipated, but his clothes were soaked, and not just from the rain. There was a large red stain on his shirt that was coloring the dirt around him as well. Panic set in and I rushed over to him, asking if he could hear me. He was conscious, but barely, and his breathing was very labored. He was able to whisper out, "Oh God, please help." I told him that I would help him and to just hold on. I grabbed my phone and immediately dialed emergency services. I struggled to explain the situation beyond, there was a guy that was bleeding out on the ground, and where I was. She told me to stay on the line and asked me if I could do anything to apply pressure to the wound and to try and stop the bleeding. I was not prepared for this situation. I didn't know the first thing about first aid, and I was so worried that I was just going to make it worse. Thankfully, she talked me through what to do. I pulled off my jacket and informed him what I was going to do. I tensed up when he gasped as I pushed on the wound, but I told him that it was going to be okay. I explained that, based on how he was injured, it looked like he'd likely been stabbed, but that I didn't see a knife anywhere. He nodded at me and quietly whispered, "Stabbed," which confirmed what I saw. As we waited for help to arrive, the man's gaze met mine, and I could see the fear in his eyes. He tried to speak, but I couldn't really hear him. I leaned closer and told him that he needed to go ahead and just stay calm, not speak, and that the ambulance was on the way, which the operator continued to assure me was the case. He was able to whisper out, "He ambushed me. Didn't see his face." I just nodded in confirmation and told him to hold on, that he would be okay. The whole thing was surreal. I had just gotten off work thinking I was going to be sitting and waiting for the bus for half an hour. Yet here I was, knelt down in the rain and holding a stranger's life in my hands. The sirens as they approached was the most welcoming sound I have ever heard. The paramedics arrived quickly, taking over within seconds, trading places with me and getting the man into the ambulance. One of the medics actually thanked me for calling them, as I may have saved this man's life, and that I did a damn good thing. Then the police arrived and started asking me questions about what I'd seen, what I'd heard. I told them what I could, but I couldn't offer a lot, as I had only heard him groaning and pretty much stumbled onto the situation. It was pretty clear that whoever had attacked him was long gone, and they had just left him for dead on the side of the road. And they also told me that he was lucky that I had found him, that if it had been a few more moments, there was a good chance that he wouldn't have made it. After giving my statement and telling them everything a couple of times over, I was left at the bus stop to sit there and replay the entire event over in my mind. The bus did arrive, right on time, and I got home without issue. But that night was a rough one. I learned later on that he did survive the attack, but that the assailant was never caught. It's a terrifying thought that I've had multiple times over. The fact that, had I left work on time, there was a chance that that guy would have died there in the bushes. I don't know the exact time he was attacked, but I would have likely been running on the bus and gone on without even noticing he was there. It's the one night that I'm glad that I had to work a few minutes late, because that inconvenience may have been the saving grace that kept that man alive. I've always found walking at night to be relaxing. And when I adopted my dog, Mari, I gave myself more reason to get out and take a long walk every night. Mari was a large and very friendly German Shepherd mix. Mix with what, I don't remember, but he was mostly Shepherd, and he was the sweetest dog that I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. There was one night in the fall when we'd gone walking down one of our normal trails where things went a bit sour. But thankfully we got out mostly unscathed. All thanks to Mari. It was a pretty typical fall night. Mostly overcast, a bit chilly, and the wind was pretty strong, which told me that we were probably going to get some rain. But I figured that we could get out and get a walk in before it hit. It had been a pretty crappy day at work, so when I got home, I ate my dinner quickly, grabbed Mari's leash, and headed out. A little bit into the walk, it started to rain softly, which was fine. We weren't going to be stopped by a little water from the sky. Our trail took us through a number of residential streets before it looped back through a small wooded park. When we got to the park area, the rain had started to pick up, which prompted me to grab my umbrella, which I was thankful that I brought along with us. But we were going to finish the path, because Mari was very much wanting to keep going. When we got to the wooded end of the park, Mari happily trotting along and giving his soft barks randomly, his way of telling me that he was happy and wanted to keep walking. In the middle of his happy stomps, he paused and lifted his head, perking his ears. I paused next to him and asked him what was up, assuming that he just saw an owl or a raccoon or something. He was staring very intently into the darkness beyond the path. I tried to follow his gaze, but whatever it was that he saw was invisible to me. I knelt down, gave him some pats, and pulled him a bit to get him to continue. He did, but he was slow as he pressed on. As we took a few steps forward, I couldn't seem to shake this growing anxiety that something was up. He was being too cautious for my liking, and I was starting to feel off. I thought maybe it was just a mix of the cold, the isolation of the trail, and the weather, but making up excuses for the off feeling wasn't doing it for me. Maury stopped again, this time perking his ears up, and the fur on his back was starting to fluff as well, which really made me feel a bit freaked out. He was normally a very calm boy, but the mood that he was displaying was one of caution and tense defensiveness. Around that time, I started to hear what sounded like footsteps mirroring our slow pace, but slightly off rhythm. I paused again, listening closely, but as I stopped, so did the other footsteps. I scanned the trees and bushes around us, but I couldn't see anything. And at this point, I was kicking myself for not bringing an actual flashlight. My iPhone wasn't cutting it. It lit the path well enough in front of us, but if you've ever used an older cell phone flashlight outside on a dark and rainy evening, you know that it's wholly ineffective. At this point, I was feeling very uneasy and was beginning to panic. My instincts were telling me that we were not in a safe position, so I figured we could make the quick trip off the path and cut the walk short. As we turned the corner, I started to hear the sound again, and I was certain that it was footsteps. This time they were quicker though, as if they were trying to catch up to us. I kept the leash tight and kept Mari as close to me as I could. He kept his body brushing against my leg the entire time, and was definitely ready to protect us if necessary. Something that I wanted to avoid if possible. I knew that he could tell I was freaking out by how he was holding himself. After another minute or two of walking, I knew that we were at an impasse, that I was going to have to confront this person that was clearly following us. I turned around quickly, and I shined the light as best as I could in the direction of where I thought the person was, and I loosened my grip on the leash slightly to let Maury step forward toward whoever it was. He wasn't going to be able to actually get to them unless they were within 6 feet of us, but he would be able to take a stance in front of me. As I turned my light, it highlighted the shape of a person behind me, wearing a dark hoodie. Maury saw him too and immediately launched into an aggressive tirade of growling and deep threatening barks. As soon as this happened, I watched as this person stopped, obviously surprised that I was confronting them. They immediately turned back the other way on the path and took off at top speed. My heart was pounding, mostly because I was right that I was being followed. And worse yet, their reaction tells me that they probably had malicious intent. It could have been a normal person running away because a dog was barking at them, but I feel like a normal person that wasn't being a creep would have stopped and said something, not sprinted off into the rain. After this happened, I pulled on Mari and jogged the rest of the way off the path and back to my street. I was running on a lot of adrenaline and panic, so I made pretty good time. That night put me in a bit of a panic over walking that trail, and for a few nights after that we took the shorter path, one that was much better lit, and we avoided the park. This also triggered a bit of common sense in me, and after that night, I never went out without something to protect myself. I know that Mari would have protected me with his life, but I also didn't want him to have to. I did end up calling the police about this. I informed them that there was someone wearing dark clothing that had been following me on the trail through the park. I know that it wasn't much to report, but they said they would send some patrols through the area to see if they could find anyone. If them being around did anything to deter this person from doing this again, then I don't regret calling them. The incident did leave me a bit shaken, but mostly unwavering. And Mari and I kept up with our nightly walks until he couldn't really do it anymore. He did pass away in 2019, at the old age of 14 years old. But he was very well loved, and he was my protector up to the end. That said, I never forgot that feeling of that night. And every night we went for a walk on a longer path, especially on rainy evenings, I would get a bit of an uneasy feeling, thinking that something like that was going to happen again. I swear on everything that I love that this is a true story. You don't have to believe me, but I want to share it anyways. I was 7 or 8 years old and lived in a house with just me and my mom. It was a fairly big house, with 4 bedrooms, and my room was at one end of the landing, and my mom's room was at the other end. If you were to stand by my bedroom door, you would look down the hallway and see my mom's bedroom door, as well as the top of the stairs. Anyways, my 2 slightly older cousins, 9 female and 11 female, had come over for a sleepover, and we had spent the whole evening/early night playing around and doing childish things as you do. My mom told us it was time for bed, and they went to sleep in the spare room and I went to my bedroom. When I was younger, I had really bad trouble sleeping and would often wake up around 2 to 3 a.m. and walked down the hall and go into my mom's bed and sleep there. Almost every night I would do this. Anyway, so it comes to about 3 a.m. and I wake up. I get out of my bed, and I open my door as quiet as I could to not wake anyone else up. As I rub my eyes and look down the hall, I see a floating dress with tears in it that looked exactly like what you would expect a wedding dress that has been worn by someone living in a forest or on the streets. It had tears in it, it was a bit muddy at the bottom. It was floating almost like it was moving through water. There was a woman wearing this torn and muddy dress walking down the stairs. I remember freezing and slowly walking back, closing my door a bit and getting into bed. I put my pillows over my head and closed my eyes and pretended I was asleep. I can't remember how much longer I was awake for before falling back asleep, but the first thing I did when I woke up was tell my mom and cousins. Obviously, as a little kid, my mom didn't believe me and my cousins thought I was trying to scare them. I'm 20 years old now, moved houses a long time ago. I remember this woman walking down the stairs so clearly that I could draw you a picture of it now. I tell this story to people to this day and obviously no one believes me. But I swear on everything that I saw something that night. There was something in my house. Hi, Raven. I'm a huge fan of your podcast, and I listen to it every night because I can't sleep without something playing. Anyways, down to business. For reference, I'm a 17-year-old male. In June, earlier this year, me and my brother went on vacation up to Missouri to visit my grandparents. During this trip, we went to an early 1800s mansion known throughout the state as the Hunter Dawson House. As we were standing up on the front lawn and the tour guide was talking about the mansion, I began to feel uncomfortable, like I didn't belong there. I didn't want my grandma to ask anything, so I just acted interested instead. When the tour guide led us in the house, I was awestruck by the beauty of the interior. It wasn't until we finished the tour of the first floor and went upstairs that I began to feel uneasy again. For the record, I've had a general fascination with the paranormal, and when we went into the former children's room, I was just about done. The vibe was totally creepy, like someone was watching me. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up, and I kind of felt like I was going to be sick. But for the sake of my grandma, I swallowed my fear and tried to pay attention to what the tour guide was saying. After the kids' room, we went into a woman's room. The tour guide said that this room belonged to the wife of the man who built the house. As he was talking about the wife, he opened a closet, and what I saw made my heart leap into my mouth. It was a woman's dress. There wasn't anything bad about the dress. It was what or who was in it. It was one of those stuffed torso dummies that you would see in a clothing store, but for a fleeting moment, it looked like an old woman was wearing it. The woman was old with long white hair pulled up into a bun and many wrinkles. As soon as I saw her, she was gone. Soon after, the tour wrapped up and we made our way out of the house. When I stepped out through the front door, I took a huge sigh of relief. I loved the tour, but I wanted to get as far away from that house as fast as I could. For anyone who wants to go to the house and has a thing for the paranormal, just be careful. Hey, okay. My boyfriend was driving and I was sitting in the passenger seat. It was nighttime and we were traveling across the state to stay at my parents' house for a while. Our rent got too expensive, and we needed somewhere else to stay so that we could save up to get our own place again. Not relevant to the story, but it provides some background. We were casually listening to the radio and chatting between ourselves when it started to rain. Okay, it wasn't too bad. Driving in the rain wasn't a big deal. We had our headlights on and we drove through the country road. Unfortunately, our trip slowed down when my boyfriend couldn't see anymore. We stopped at one of those 24-hour service stations that had warm food. We sat inside, ate, and other than the clerk, there were no other customers in there with us. And then a beat-up-looking truck drove into a parking spot. A scruffy and wet-looking man with dirty clothes came into the station, and we noticed the smell. A musty, foul, and almost fishy odor hung in the air. I thought maybe he was a fisherman, or just didn't have decent hygiene. We tried to be polite and did not look at him or anything. He walked around, looking at the items, and then came and looked at us. Whenever we would look at him, he would drop his gaze and then look elsewhere. I noticed him doing this a couple of times. I figured he was going to ask us for some change or something, so I ignored him. My boyfriend and I forgot that he was there during our conversation. Finally, we finished our food and the rain was beginning to ease off, so we went out and got in the car and left. After a bit, we noticed some headlights driving behind us. My boyfriend recognized that it was the same man from the service station. Since we were driving on the highway, we didn't think too much of it. He was probably just headed towards the same place that we were. It was only when we drove into his parents' suburb that beat-up-looking truck followed us. We pulled over by the side of the road and he did the same. He didn't get out of the car. He just sat there and stared at us with the headlights still on. My boyfriend was going to get out, but I grabbed his arm and told him not to. I didn't know if this guy had a gun or some other kind of weapon, and I didn't want him to get hurt. He stayed in the car with me, and after a while, we drove off. I wasn't surprised when I saw those same damn headlights following us in the rain. I really did not like this. We drove around for a while. We couldn't really speed up, and we didn't want to crash. It's hard to explain, but he just seemed to disappear. We saw the headlights, and then we didn't. I don't know if it was some kind of weird glitch that happened, whether he drove off or what exactly happened. It's honestly a mystery. Maybe people in the comments section can help me work out what happened there. So from there, we spent some time at his parents' place, and we had to go get some extra blankets and towels for the house. While we were out, we actually noticed a missing poster for that man. He looked cleaner, healthier, and the poster said that there were grave concerns for his health. We reported it to the police, but there were no leads. The posters for him are still up around town, and through the small town gossip, I heard that his truck was stolen and never seen again. I think it's one of those stories where there is some truth to it, but there were some other reports of him being seen, but that he was a ghost. I don't think that's the case. And it's in bad taste to say that he is a ghost, or make up some BS story about it. So I don't know if it was actually him or not. Maybe he was staring at us because he wanted help. I do feel bad if we were his last chance, but we equally did not want to get hurt either. It sucks how you have to be careful about who you help, because some people are crazy, or predatory. But you gotta do what you gotta do. I don't know if he was ever found, or if he remains a missing person. And as strange as it sounds, I don't think it would have been anywhere near as unsettling if it hadn't been raining. The thick rain made it difficult to see, and we had to go slower unless we wanted to get into a car accident. I'm not really sure how to end this, but I do want to say that you're one of the best in the narration game, Raven, and I hope that this story was good enough to narrate. It was, and thank you. I'm either going crazy, or my apartment is haunted. At first, I thought that I was dreaming, because my first week in the bedroom I heard a female yell with surprise, "What are you doing here?" The next thing that happened is that things will go missing for weeks at a time and pop up again in places that I'm sure I checked. Then I started seeing shadows dart across the room of my vision. This week, she let out a scared scream at the foot of my bed, like she was surprised and gasped. I went back to bed, and then this thing slapped the foot of my bed so hard that I felt the mattress dip next to my foot. I'll admit at this point I was more angry than surprised, so I told her to cut that crap out. Big mistake. Because before I wasn't sure it was being haunted, because it always happened late at night when I was almost asleep. But yesterday, she turned on an adult toy that I have. It's embarrassing. I know, but she turned it on, and I promise this is not satire. I got up and turned it off, and even put the on button facing the ceiling, in case maybe the button just got pressed down somehow. As soon as I sat it back down, she turned it back on. And at this point, I was a little scared, so I turned it back off and tried to go back to bed. She turned it on again. I threw the thing away at 4 in the morning into the dumpster on the street. I then tried to go back to bed, and I could hear her breathing next to my bed. I then got this overwhelming feeling that I was being stared at until about 6 a.m. when I finally had it and got up out of bed anyways. I know it's a she because I've heard her voice, and it's always been scared, like I shouldn't be here. I live on an army barracks, and ending one's life is very common. My theory is that some girl took her life in the room, and that she doesn't know that she's dead. I didn't believe in ghosts before PCSing here, but I've taken to talking to her gently before I do things. I tell her that I'm about to turn on some music, or that she has the place to herself, when I leave for work. I'm honestly hoping that she just thinks I'm her roommate or something, because obviously this was her space and she isn't tracking that she's dead. She's never been violent or aggressive with me, but she has a habit of doing these things in the dead of the night and terrifying me. I need advice on what to do, because she is very real, and she's made a believer out of me, but I'd be lying if I said that she doesn't scare me. So, I'm 20 years old, and I'm getting married to my fiancé in October. And I know that the house across the street from us is haunted, and we maybe stirred up the spirits doing a little spooky ghost investigation, but me and my best friend have both seen something dark. I am a Christian, and I believe in the paranormal. One day when my fiancé was at work, I heard what sounded like my soon-to-be brother-in-law's voice from the living room. It sounded like him saying my name and asking if I was downstairs. Me and my fiancé live in a basement apartment. This wasn't abnormal because he would come down and ask me questions, so I answered with, "Yeah, what is it?" But there was no response. I then heard what sounded like the screen door closing, so I thought maybe he left. I got up to investigate, and there was no one there. I called my soon-to-be mother-in-law, and she asked him if he came downstairs, and the scary thing is that he said he hadn't been down there at all. I know what I heard, and it sounded exactly like him. That's not the scariest part. Yet another day, my fiancé was in the restroom, and I saw him go in there, and heard the door close. As I'm on the couch, not even a few minutes later, out of the corner of my eye, I see what looks exactly like him. Tall, gray sleep shorts and a shirt, standing outside the bathroom. Which, admittedly, I thought was weird because I had heard the door close. So I look up, and he's not there. A few minutes later, he comes out from the bathroom. My best friend was over, and it was time to go to sleep, so I was praying when I thought I heard her whisper my name, so I stopped praying and asked what she wanted. But she swears that she never said a word. That being said, one day she was in the shower, and the water was running, but I wasn't paying much attention. So I didn't hear the water stop running. When out of the corner of my eye, I see what looks like her curly hair, and her tie-dye shorts, and one of her shirts. And again, I know for a fact that she is in the shower. So I look up to say something to her, and she's not there. Not a few minutes later, she comes out of the bathroom. Another day, I'm sitting at the table eating, and my fiancé goes to the restroom. I hear the door close, and I just keep eating. I kid you not, I thought he was still behind me, because it felt like someone was standing behind me looking over my shoulder. But when I turned around to give him a kiss, there was nobody there. So I shrug and go back to being on my phone when yet again, I swear, I saw what looked like him in his black shirt and work pants, walking towards our bunny cage. But when I look up, there's no one there. Another time, my best friend was over and she comes screaming out of the bathroom, telling me to hurry and go upstairs. Once we get up there, she tells me that she got out of the bathroom and saw what looked like a 7 or 8 foot tall black shadow that ducked when she looked at it. Whatever this thing is, it mimics my loved ones, and I don't like it. I was in bed and saw the same shadow she was talking about next to the bed, so I covered up my head and hid. I don't know what this is, but whatever it is, it isn't good.